Sometimes it's soft, that's enough. 'Cause as it all falls down, it's all lost, yet I am found. Feeling safe, feeling sound. As forward may I always have a sore place to fall, a soft place to fall, yeah. To fall, soft place to fall. To fall.
Thank you, Jarrett. So this man is amazing. Reverend Brian Akers has been involved with the Science of Mind teaching since he was 12 years old. This is what can happen if you work with our youth. Good plug, right? He has served in leadership roles with teens, youth, and family ministry, and is currently the senior minister of the Columbia Center for Spiritual Living in Columbia, Maryland. He describes himself as a humanitarian, a religious science minister, a community leader, an advocate for active and practical spirituality, and a purveyor of social and spiritual conviction. Please give us a warm Salt Lake Center welcome to Reverend Brian Akers.
Well, good morning. So I am the man, the myth, and the legend, apparently. And, you know, it's interesting when I found out I was going to come out here to Salt Lake City with my wife to enjoy some spiritual practices with her family. I had the opportunity yesterday to attend a baptism in the Mormon community down in Draper. And boy, if there's not a whole myriad of different flavors of this thing we call God, huh? And, you know, it's interesting when we find ourselves in this position where we are entering into a month where all of them are vying for our attention, right? In December, and I don't want to misquote or anything, but in December there's something like 30 or 40 or 50, 60, who knows, I don't know. There's a large number of spiritual teachings that place a lot of sacred emphasis on the month of December. And they're all vying for our attention, and we know which ones have the most buying power anyway, because we see them most prevalently and most regularly. But today's theme that I was asked to speak on is, we are the light of the living Spirit. And so December, as you guys go through the rest of this month, you'll be talking about a statement that Dr. Holmes, Ernest Holmes, made. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Dr. Ernest Holmes, he's the author of the Science of Mind text, the founder of our teaching, the Science of Mind. And he wrote a series of statements, the first edition of the Science of Mind magazine, about what we believe. And it was just a basic 13-point outline of the core tenets of his philosophy, the teaching of the Science of Mind. And one of them is the one that's this month is based on, and it is that we believe in God, the living Spirit Almighty. Now keep in mind, this is a man who was speaking in his era, so those words were written sometime in 1920s, I think mid-1920s, plus or minus. And I'll read them to you again, because again, this is what we believe as practitioners of this faith, is that we believe in God, the living Spirit Almighty. Now, isn't it interesting that when we hear the word God, that we have an opportunity to check in with ourselves about what we've allowed ourselves to accept as the definition of that term. You know, being around nonconformists so much, and of course I'm sure there's a couple of nonconformists out there. I think I see you guys. Yeah, on a Sunday morning in this building, that's a statement of your nonconformity. And what happens is we find ourselves at tension with what we typically have heard, or what we typically, especially in this nation, have been taught about the word God. Would you guys agree? The word God has some pretty specific public connotation to it, right? And so when we hear that word being used, sometimes we may feel a little tinge if it is calling us to think of or believe in or identify something that we're resisting, right? So just by a show of hands, anybody here resisting the idea of the entity in another place called heaven that has created this place? Okay. 4, 5, 6, 6. Can I get a 6, 6, 7, 7, 7? Got 7, 7 here, 7, 8. Can I get an 8, 8? There's 8 right there, back in the back corner. So sometimes that causes some tension, but that's not true for all of us. Sometimes I think we get together under a similar banner and think that because we're under that similar banner, that we all have the exact same identification, the exact same definition of what we think our spirituality is, right? And so we come together and we're like, yeah, and then somebody uses a word we don't like, and we're like, wait a second, where am I? What's going on? But in reality, when we talk about God, throughout human history, in every opportunity, every chance, every time it's ever been used, it has simply been that definition of the idea that there is something greater, something grander, something mightier. And as Dr. Holmes described it, something that is almighty, depending on who you're listening to. In fact, even people who were not necessarily known as, religious theologians had ideas about this. Albert Einstein said, "It's that deep emotional conviction of the presence of a superior reasoning power, which is revealed in the incomprehensible universe, forms my idea of God." Is that a new definition for some of you guys? Maybe, maybe not. What's interesting about that is that from every walk of life, this concept, this idea that there is something greater than us as individuals has always found its way into our society, into our culture, into our language. And it just so happens that the most popular one that we know is God, that is this language that we use to describe this almighty presence, this all-pervasive idea Dr. Holmes sometimes referred to it as. But in our teaching, and as metaphysicians, as religious scientists, as whatever the heck name you, and this is the truth. If you don't like the word God, every time you hear me say the word God, I want you to just go ahead and put whatever the heck word in there you like, right? Because as we're coming together, understanding and intent is always going to be more important than our language. And there's no more important time in our nation that this has been true for us to remember. Right? Because right now, language is dividing us in a myriad of ways, isn't it? And so I'm going to invite you that if I use any words that you don't like today, don't use them. Right? If I use any words today that you don't think work for you, find the one that you think does and use it. I beg of you for your grace, for your willingness to hear that as I speak and what I'm trying to convey to you today is something that is greater than the words that I am finding to share that with you. Can you make that agreement with me today? Okay, so if I offend you, I'm sorry. But ultimately, we have to come to some place where we begin to have a conversation where everyone knows what the heck we're talking about, don't we? At some point, we have to say, okay, we've used a million words to try and describe a thing, but let's just make some basic agreements on what it is that we mean when we talk about this idea. And so that's what I'm going to try and help us do today. As you move into December, I'm going to invite you guys as a community that's currently in its own state of flux and transition, a community that's currently defining and identifying and empowering and emboldening that within itself that it is seeking to bring into the world, that it is seeking to express, to come together on an understanding of what we mean as you move into December to discuss this idea that you believe in God, the living Spirit Almighty. And so Dr. Holmes wrote something very interesting. And we have to remember that, Dr. Holmes was a person just like we were, right? He just was finding the best words he could find to describe these ideas that he was discovering. And so this is his interpretation of the idea that God itself, this almighty thing, whatever you choose to describe that almighty thing, that it is revealing itself through us and as us. Dr. Holmes said, if one would know God, then he must penetrate deeply into his own nature. For here alone can he find him. If he would reveal God to his fellow men, he must do so by living such a God-like life that the divine essence flows through him to others. The only way to know God is to be like him. Now, there's a lot of patriarchal language in there, isn't there? Right? And typically when I read this stuff, I try to conjugate that stuff into more universal terms. But since we're talking about language today, I just wanted to kind of float it out there in the way it was written, right? And to find out if we have enough grace and spiritual discipline to remain open to the idea that if we were here today and we could explain to him why we would prefer that he used a more gender-neutral language, that he would probably acquiesce. Don't you agree? A guy who wrote a text about the all-pervasive nature of God being inside each and every human being would probably be immediately willing to change that. But because we're being inundated with language, we're the ones who have to take responsibility for this idea that if it's going to be leveraged in a way that it improves our lives, that we must be the interpreters of the language, right? And so why go out of our way to change the language dramatically when as soon as we leave this room, the agreements are different? Right? Because even if in this room we'd agree to talk about God or the idea of God as spirit or the universe, or my friend likes to use Bob, whatever agreement we made, we are already very aware of the agreement that's been made outside of these walls, aren't we? And so what we want to do is we want to call ourselves to a place of grace with others that allows us to hear ourselves and our truth in their language, right? And so what Dr. Holmes was talking about here is this idea that we don't believe in the idea that there is an entity outside of ourselves that is the Almighty, that is a God, that is someone or something that lives in some other realm, other place, that is the almighty presence of the world. What we believe in this teaching is that it is actually having its life by means of each and every one of us. Now that seems like a cool concept, right? That this idea that something powerful, the presence of all the creative power, all the love, all the peace, all the beauty, all the joy that could ever be in existence is having its life by means of us. So that means that God's life is our life. But I'll tell you what tends to happen very often is that we tend to think that what that means is that there's some other thing that's going to save us from ourselves. You see, this is not a teaching of saviorship. It just ain't, right? We don't believe that there is some otherworldly force that is desperately coming here to save us, right? Is there anybody here that came here this morning to be saved? Just checking. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be saved from ourselves? What happens is we come together and we talk about the presence and the all-pervading nature of good that God is. If God is all there is, then everything in existence must come from that one thing, right? But we also know that that means that what comes from it must be it. That in fact, if there's something, if God is expressing itself, everything that it has expressed is also itself, right? Kind of complicated stuff. Hey, anybody ever get wrapped up in the intellectualization of this stuff ever? Right? Oh, I'll think it, and then it'll come true, and then life is going to be perfect. Right? This idea that we can think a happier thought, and that suddenly we will have a happier life, is a common misconception that not only frustrates our ability to express our good, but kind of lets us off the hook of having to save us from ourselves. This idea that there is something in the universe that will intervene on our behalf. I'm not trying to break up too many sacred cows all in one talk, right? But this idea that there is something that will save us from ourselves is inconsistent with our teaching. And so the only way that we can improve our life, that we can connect with this idea that there is a living spirit and that living spirit has a life. And what did we already decide? if God is living and we're alive, we literally are the living Spirit of God itself, right? It's all one thing, and so it must be what we are, right? So Dr. Holmes says, if we think we can guide our brother right while our own feet still walk in darkness, we are mistaken. We must first clarify our own vision, and then we shall become as lights, lighting the way for others. You know, what happens oftentimes is that there's this feeling that we have that we want something new, and so we go into prayer. And in prayer, we establish that mental equivalent, that archetype, that idea, that imaginary image, that picture, that ideal that we're trying to create in our lives that we want to receive. What we know about the universe is that the universe is affirmative. Is that one you guys have heard before? It's not positive or negative. Those are words that we made up. It's affirmative. That means that God says yes. That the law takes that which you will into it and affirms it and makes it so. Now, I don't know about you guys, but there's been some times in my life where I haven't paid a whole lot of attention to just what it was I was asking the universe to affirm for me. And so what that called me to do was to get angry or upset or frustrated. And so where do you think my decisions were made from? Upsettedness and frustration and anger. And so the law, being affirmative, does not come in and go, whoa, 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 Brian, hey, bruh, calm down. No, the law goes, okay. Not because it doesn't love you, but because it loves you so much that it literally has an inability to say no to you. And so then you may find that in your life you've experienced some depth of frustration and anger and pain. It isn't until we walk hand in hand with this understanding in every single decision that we make that we begin to elicit the life that we know is promised to us by this teaching. It's not promised to us in spite of us. It is promised to us because it is our divine right to assert our truth at any given moment. But that means that who has to be the steward of what we're asking for from the law? We do. We are the literal living life of God. And so what happens sometimes is people are looking for that clue or that hint, what to do next. And the universe will always give that to you. If you've gone into prayer and you've set forth an archetype that you want to experience more love in your life, you will immediately begin to see opportunities to be a greater lover. That's the way the world works. You will be presented those opportunities. But what happens to those opportunities if you choose something other than love in that moment? You see, we must remember that every thought and every choice is a prayer. That every time we move from one place to another, that we do so by our own volition. And that it is us who calls from the world around us that which we desire. And if the place, everybody's heard this stuff, the power of now, right? Eckhart Tolle. The present moment is so important. Where you have the most authority in your creative life is what you do right this second. We could all, if we wanted to, strip down and run out into the street, wave our hands in the air, and there'd be nothing in this world to stop us, except our own sense of common decency. And so we are the ones who determine what it is that we'll do next. But if we're constantly praying for good and making choices that do not reaffirm that good, then we can never live in the presence of the good that we're pining for, and there is nothing on this earth that has stopped us from that experience but ourselves. Now that might seem kind of depressing to think about it in those terms. But what if we were to shift the terms and to look at it from the standpoint of potential rather than our current reality? What if we were to realize that not only can we pray in the solitude of our own mind and our own soul for the presence of love to have a grander expression in our life, but that we could literally go out into the world and have so much faith in the idea that this thing works, that every single time that we're presented with an opportunity to share more love, that we said yes. that not only the universe was prepared to say yes to us, but that we had developed and cultivated so much faith that we had no fear about what the consequence may be if we were to show up as a greater presence of the living truth of love in every area of our life. That's powerful stuff. That's the kind of thing that we can feel, right? And let's not forget, when we communicate with the divine, when we communicate with the law, when we communicate with God, God doesn't care about our words. There's no right or wrong words about the way we communicate to the infinite, to the divine. It sees past every word we've ever made. It sees through every statement we've ever crafted. It penetrates beyond the articulation of every prayer that has ever been uttered, and it drills right down into the sense and the presence and the emboldening feeling that's being called for in every moment. And it's from this place that we communicate with the divine. Is by cultivating a sense within ourselves that when we are calling to love, it's not because we have found the most loving language. It is because there is a commitment to us so deeply held within us that can feel and sense the presence of that love, that we afford it all of our grace and our time and our energy. That every time we speak to another, that we speak to another from an understanding that even if we flub up the words a little bit, that we're feeling the love that we're sharing with them as we speak. That when we pray for ourselves, that even if we feel that we're not the most articulate or that we don't have, 10 years of practice doing eloquent, poetic prayer, right? That for some reason our prayer, because it doesn't have the language, is less potent. No, we breathe into that the very feeling of the prayer that we demand, and the words cease to have any authority over us. This thing is really about keeping it simple. That's what this teaching is about. Being the living Spirit is about being so willing to take the accountability and responsibility to create love in the world, and having so much faith in the idea that the conspiracy of love will absolutely lift us up in every way, shape, and form, in every relationship, in every area of our life, be it work, be it spiritual, be it family, be it political. That if we arrive as the presence of love in every area of our life, and that if we allow ourselves to embody the sense of what that love is, that the language itself will be hashed out on a level that is so much grander and so much beautifuler than simply ourselves, that every single time we engage each other, that we create something unique, powerful, and brilliant, and that is the life of God. Not the idea, not the imaginary experience, not the hope, not the desire, but the actual sharing, the actual living, the actual being of our good is the potency of life that we're afforded in this teaching. And I know this is true because Dr. Holmes told me so. So, and I tell people, I've had this Science of Mind textbook for a long time. What I tell people is, if you haven't read the Science of Mind textbook, we're not a doctrinal philosophy, so you don't need to read the whole thing and memorize it, right? And really, truly, this looks like a kind of a thick, intimidating book. If you just took the first 4 sections of the book, the first 4 sections of your Science of Mind text has everything that you actually need to know. All of that is just him trying to explain it as many ways as possible so that he can speak to as many people as possible. But this comes right out of the front of one of those, and it's titled, it's on page 41. If there's 2 pages that you need to know in this book, it's 41 and 52. But 41, I'll let you figure out 52, it's a trip. 41, it's a section titled, A Riddle of Simplicity. It is a beautiful and true thought to realize that every human being stands in the shadow of a mighty mind, a pure intelligence, and a divine givingness. Not alone unto the great comes the soft tread of the unseen guest. The arrogant have not perceived the simplicity of faith, but the pure in heart see God. The farmer has seen it, the heavenly host in his fields. The child has frolicked with it at play. The mother has clasped it to her breast, and the fond lover has seen it in the eyes of their beloved. We look too far away for reality. The intelligence by and through which we perceive that there is a spiritual presence and an infinite mind in the universe constitutes our receptivity to it and decides its flow through us. We have made a riddle out of simplicity. Therefore, we have not read the sermons written in the stones, nor interpreted the light of love running through life. You know, to practice this teaching and this faith does not demand of us that we have some intellectual prowess that is preferential or that is aggrandized or that is greater or grander or bigger or better than anyone or anything or any religion or theology. It is our willingness to embrace the accountability that the living flesh of God, the body of God itself, is the one we inhabit now. The knowing that as we move from this place, from this sanctuary, this safe and beautiful, loving space that we've created together this morning, out into the world, that we take that flesh, that we take those words, that we take this feeling and this presence, and that we are the literal life of God, spreading its love through its own example by means of us. There is no one here to save you or anyone else from themselves. There is only a deep, powerful, resounding desire to give more love, more grace, more time, more life. And so as I invite the practitioners to come forward this morning to pray with us, I invite you to know that as we step into this prayer, that we move beyond the language that we use to come together, and that we simply allow that language to inspire us to develop a feeling within ourselves that is so powerful that it stretches out into our fingertips and into our toes, so that as we've recharged our spiritual batteries this morning, that when we step out of this room, that we inspire one another to live a loving life in the very image of the loving life that we desire to experience, because we are the living Spirit of the Almighty, right now and forevermore. Please join me in this affirmative prayer. And so as we call forth that sense, that feeling, that knowing that there is only one presence in all of existence, that the farthest celestial body and the nearest molecule are absolutely moving with the fervor and the creative prowess of infinite divine love. That it is all that there is, that it moves in us, through us, as us, and for us, as we call it into being in this prayer now. Because we have accepted that not only does it live in all things, but that its life is being had by means of us, that our life is God's life right now, right here where we are, together. And so as we've known this, we set the tone now for this holiday season, for the month of December, a season of light, a season where we are drawn closer together by nature, and that we are giving love by choice. And so we choose that love so beautifully, so powerfully now, that there can be nothing that lives outside of it. And we afford our grace and our candor and our absolute willingness to give that love and to share that love to every single person that we have ever seen. And so we dismiss any idea that there is any enemy, that there is any resistance, that there is any us and any them. For we step into the light now together, knowing that we do the work of the Almighty when we do the work of lighting the way for ourselves and for others. And so we give great thanks for one another as we've come here to celebrate this morning, for all of our many blessings and for all of the things that have been revealed to us through this process of simply being present in this moment, in this life of love, as we surrender it to the law, as we lovingly give it over to that which conspires for our good, which takes our tiny imagination of how it could be and turns it into an even greater and grander experience of what it truly is in the living potential of life, because there is always something greater seeking to emerge, and this prayer has set that good forth now. As we allow it to be, knowing it is already done, and together we say, and so it is. Amen. Thank you.